So, how do you build a nation? Do you think of big declarations and famous battles? Or is it something else, something more personal? Today, we're going to explore how a nation is built from the ground up, all through the incredible stories of ordinary people who are thrown into the most extraordinary circumstances you can imagine.
Okay, let's really dive into that question. Because the answer probably isn't in the history books you're used to. It's written in the lives of individuals, in their struggles, their survival, and ultimately, their legacy. It's a story of crime, unimaginable punishment, and the unlikely creation of a whole new world.
And this epic story, this story of a family that would literally spread across an entire continent, it all begins with the smallest, most mundane things. A couple of petty crimes, an act of desperation probably, on the grimy streets of 18th century London that would kick off a journey to the other side of the planet.
At the very heart of our story are two people. Their small crimes led to a punishment so severe, it wouldn't just change their lives forever, it would actually help lay the very foundations of a new country. I mean, just look at the sheer imbalance here. On one side, you've got John Ryan. He stole clothing worth 13 shillings. On the other, Sarah Woolley, who stole some cotton worth just 8 shillings. These were minor crimes, likely born of pure poverty, but their sentences, they were identical and absolutely life-shattering, 7 years transportation. That meant being exiled to a penal colony on the other side of the world, a place they would almost certainly never return from.
Now, their paths to exile were totally separate. John was tried way back in 1784, and after a failed escape attempt, he was put on a ship called the Friendship as part of the now famous First Fleet. Sarah's conviction came 5 years later, and her journey was on the Second Fleet, a voyage that would earn a much darker reputation.
John's journey on the First Fleet was no pleasure cruise, don't get me wrong, but the conditions were relatively well managed for the time. Sarah's voyage, though, that was part of something truly horrific. It was a fleet so infamous, it became a byword for pure suffering.
This contemporary account describes what people saw when Sarah's ship, the Neptune, finally arrived. The convicts were so sick and emaciated from things like scurvy and dysentery that some of them literally died in the boats as they were being rowed ashore. It was described as a more horrid spectacle than anything that had ever been witnessed in the new colony.
Yeah, the Second Fleet was so badly mismanaged, so cruel, the private contractors were actually cutting rations just to increase their profits, that it became known as the Death Fleet. Hundreds died. So for Sarah Woolley to even step off that ship alive was an incredible testament to her will to live. Her new life could only begin after she had endured absolute hell on water.
But this is where the story truly begins. Because against all odds, these two survivors of the British justice system, they found each other at the edge of the known world. And they didn't just survive, they built something new.
So get this, just a year after her horrific arrival, Sarah was sent to Norfolk Island, a small settlement off the Australian coast. And who does she meet there? John Ryan. In 1791, these two former convicts, a world away from the courts that condemned them, got married. They started a family and began to carve a life out of absolutely nothing.
And this chart, wow, this just brilliantly illustrates Sarah's incredible transformation. After John passed away, Sarah was listed as a landowner in her own right, a status that was incredibly rare for any woman at the time, let alone a former convict. She went from being a prisoner with nothing to a self-sufficient farmer and a matriarch, building a prosperous life, managing acres of land, a ton of livestock, and a growing family.
Tragically, she died in a carriage accident in 1809, and this tribute appeared in the Sydney Gazette. It speaks of a much-lamented friend, admired for her kindness and obliging manners. Now, that is not the description of a criminal. This was a respected member of the community. She had completely, utterly remade her identity. But Sarah's death wasn't the end of this story. No way. It was the beginning of a legacy that her children and their children's children would carry forward, pushing out across this vast, unexplored continent.
You can literally trace their pioneering spirit right across the map of Australia. Each generation pushed further out. You have Sarah and John in New South Wales. Then their daughter moves down to Tasmania. The next generation chases the gold rush over to Victoria. By the fourth generation, they'd moved west, and the fifth generation, Eric James Gardner, was born in Western Australia. The descendants of convicts had become the settlers of a continent. But the family's story of survival and endurance, it doesn't stop there. It keeps going, right into the 20th century, where their legacy would be tested all over again, this time not by forced exile, but by a brutal global conflict.
So, meet Eric James Gardner.
150 years after his ancestors were forcibly sent to Australia as prisoners of the state, he voluntarily signed up to defend that very same country. The grandson of pioneers, the descendant of convicts, was now a soldier.
Eric was captured after the fall of Singapore and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Sandakan, Borneo. As the war was nearing its end, the Japanese command issued a truly chilling order. No prisoners were to survive. What followed were the Sandakan death marches, a 260-kilometer forced trek through some of the most dense, unforgiving jungles on Earth.
There is just no way to soften what this was. Historians have called it the single greatest atrocity ever committed against Australians in any war. Prisoners who were already weakened by starvation and disease were marched until they literally dropped, and those who couldn't keep up, they were killed.
Out of roughly 2,400 Australian and British prisoners who were at Sandakan, only 6 Australians survived. 6. The order to leave no one alive was carried out with an absolutely brutal efficiency.
Eric James Gardner was not one of the 6. He did not survive. 150 years after his ancestors endured a forced journey into exile, he died on a different kind of forced march, in service to the very country they helped build. All that's left is this official record, a name on a memorial.
This one family's journey, from a London courtroom all the way to a Borneo jungle, it's basically a national story in miniature. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What epic tales of survival, of struggle, and legacy are hidden away in your own family tree, just waiting to be discovered.
And that's really the takeaway here. The story of a nation isn't just one big story, it's millions of them. It's the story of a woman who survived the death fleet to become a respected landowner. It's the story of her descendant who gave his life for the country she never even chose. It's how a stolen piece of cotton can, over 150 years, become the very fabric of a new continent.